Marvelo. Okay. Hello. Welcome, everyone. So glad to have you. And welcome to our virtual audience. I always try to remember you all on there. Um, Welcome to the bookstore. Is there anybody who's here for the first time to the bookstore? Oh my gosh, welcome. Wait, I'm so excited. Usually it's like, come on, Destiny, we've been here, but welcome. So glad you're here. We have tons of events just like this one. So make sure to check out our website where you can find more information about what's going on. If you need to use the restroom upstairs and past the cash wrap, that's where the restrooms are. And of course, we have books for sale. So make sure that you support our author for this evening. We have tons to accommodate that. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our author for today. She will be signing at the end, so you can get your book signed then, and we'll be taking questions at the end of the conversation. Angie Kim is a Korean immigrant, former editor of the Harvard Law Review, and author of the international bestseller and Edgar Award winner Miracle Creek, which I loved. It has been translated into over 20 languages and named a Best Book of the Year by Time, The Washington Post, Kirkus, and The Today Show. She has written for the New York Times Book Review, The Washington Post, Vogue, and Glamour, among many others. Her second novel, Happiness Falls, which I have yet to read, is forthcoming from Hogarth Random House this fall. Please give it up for Angie Kim, who is our conversation partner today. Oh, love it. You can sit right here. Yeah, yeah. And the lady of the hour, Janika Oza, is the winner of the 2022 O. Henry Prize for Short Fiction and the 2020 Kenyon Review Short Fiction Award. She has received support from the Malay Colony, Tin House Summer, and Winter Workshops, among others. And her stories and essays have appeared in publications such as the Best Small Fictions 2019 anthology, Catapult, and others. A History of Burning is her debut novel. She lives in Toronto. Please join me in welcoming Janika.
Okay. Thank you so much for having us. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming out today. It's okay? Yeah. Okay. I'm so excited to talk to you about this beautiful book. First of all, I just need to say a little bit about how much I love this and brag about it a little bit. So it came out a few weeks ago and it's already a New York Times editor's choice. And in their review, the New York Times Book Review called it remarkable, a haunting symphonic tale that speaks to the nuanced complexities of class and trauma for this particular family, this demand and spirit for bolder storytelling that transcends borders and identities. I love that. Kirkus called it artful juggling. An ambitious family drama that skillfully explores the bonds of kinship and the yearning for peace and security. And Booklist called it a striking epic that combines powerful characters of different generations, compelling storytelling, dramatic settings and conflicts, and thoughtful exploration of displacement and belonging, family ties, citizenship, loyalty, loss, and resilience. Like, it's just unbelievable. So, I just wanted to tell you, how has the experience been so far? This is your first book. This is your debut. And this is what, your third week being on the road? Wanted to just hear a little bit about it before we talk about the book itself and the origin story and ask you to read a bit. So tell us, how does it feel?
Yeah. This is on?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Angie, and for being in conversation with me. Yeah, it has been a whirlwind. It is my first book, and to be able to be out on the road and be doing events in Canada and also across the US has been really, really special. And yeah, I am learning as I go. Yeah.
It's so fun. Okay, so tell us a little bit about, first of all, your own description, like an elevator pitch for the book. And also, where did you get the idea for this?
So A History of Burning is a novel about 4 generations of one Indo-Ugandan family across about 100 years and multiple forced migrations and lands. It moves from India to Kenya to Uganda and then into exile in Canada and the UK. And it's really a novel about the stories we pass on and the ones that we don't. It's a novel about silence in families, and it's about the lengths that we'll go to secure our own place in the world. The idea for it, well, it is very much inspired by my own family history. 3 generations of my family also lived in East Africa, and then were exiled in 1972.
Oh, wow. I was going to ask you if this is actually, so where you are in relation to the characters.
Yeah. So I'm a descendant of this history.
Okay.
I'm a generation removed from what happened. Yeah, so the inspiration is there in my family. I had been working on a different novel for a couple of years, and it was totally unrelated to this. And one day I was working on that novel, and this scene popped into my head, and I knew that it was a scene that took place in 1971. I knew it was in Kampala, Uganda. I knew it was this family at the kitchen table, and Idi Amin's coup was happening outside, and they were kind of making sense of that. I could see it very vividly, and so I thought, okay, I'm just gonna note down this idea, and then go back to my other novel. And I ended up plotting out like the entire story.
And was the scene vivid to you because you had heard about it through your parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles?
Yeah, I think there was a sense of a kind of like deep intimacy or knowing. I knew that family that was in that scene in my mind, and I kind of, very intuitively understood them. But at the same time, I think what propelled me to write that story, to put aside the other novel and turn to this one, was because I knew so little, actually. I had heard very little about this history, about our history. And so I had a lot of questions and a lot of curiosity, and that's what really propelled me.
Oh, that's awesome. I love that. Would you read to us a little bit from the beginning? And we're going to talk a lot about structure, and we're going to talk a lot about the voices. So tell us, set it for us a little bit, and the time period you're reading from the first chapter, which is from the first section.
Yeah, so I'll read just from the very opening page. So this is Pirbai 1898, and yes, the book moves forward from 1898 into all the way to 1992. So I'll just read from the start, no context needed. The last day Pirbai spent in Gujarat was ignited by a sun that could not last. The heat was a dry beast, scorching the fields yellow as Gora hair. He eased himself onto a step by the water's edge, letting his chappals graze the foam. Jamnagar offered him nothing. For as long as he could remember, every day was the same. By foot, or sometimes hitching a ride on the back of a cart, he wandered the streets, pleading for work. Today, the landowner barely raised his eyes, and he knew he was probably one of many boys turned away. Look around you, Dikro, the man had muttered. Do you see any rice, any grain? Dry, all dry. Come back after monsoon. When Pirbai pointed to the white buds bursting across a field, the man laughed until he coughed. His lips cracked and blood pulsed on his stained teeth. Those are for British exports, not for us. That morning, Pirbai had watched his ma ask the gods for forgiveness, praying over his middle sister whose bones clacked as though loose inside her skin. For days, her body had expelled water, sweat water, wee-wee water, chi water, and now she was limp and dry as the crops outside. When his ma had turned to him and told him to try Jamnagar today, that a neighbor's son had found work there last week, Pirbai had imagined saying no. He had thought about rolling over on his sleeping mat, refusing to leave home, and playing gilli danda with his siblings in the deadened grass instead. They would fight over who got to be striker and who fielder, and as the eldest, Pirbai would get first pick. He would strike the gilly all the way to the sea, and his siblings would whistle, Ma looking on in awe. But he was 13, the oldest son, no longer a boy. If he returned bearing nothing again, Ma would suck in her cheeks, then silently scrape her portion onto his plate, a reminder of the strength he would need for tomorrow. Bhai, his mother always called him, brother, reminding him of who he was, to whom he was responsible. The reddening sky warned him to start his journey back, but the wind pulling off the water stilled him. He pressed his palms to his face, the imprint of the sun behind his eyelids a single ember. When he opened his eyes, there was a man, a merchant, his belt buckle polished and skin supple and oiled so that its brown shone almost gold. The man shifted a lump of tobacco in his cheek, exposing teeth like chipped bricks. Looking for work, Dikro? Pirbai nodded, eyeing him, too wary from the day to believe. The man opened his fist for a second. It was long enough for Pirbai to spy a pile of coins, grimy but solid, winking in the late afternoon light. You and I, we were meant to find one another, the man said, and pressed a coin into Pirbai's palm. Pirbai closed his fingers over the skin-warmed metal, unable to resist its unnatural weight. You have work? The man pointed out at the water. I'm looking for boys just like you, young, tough, hardworking. You'll work hard, no? Now Pirbai focused, aware that this was his chance. He raked a hand through his hair, relieved that he still appeared strong and capable, even as his stomach curled around itself. He smiled to show the man his teeth, that they were straight and square, his best feature, a sign of inner health, his ma always bragged. I'll work the hardest, he said, and he meant it. The man clapped him on the shoulder and fished into his pocket, drawing out two things. First, a small tin of tobacco, which he flipped open and offered to Pirbai. Tentatively, Pirbai accepted, taking a pinch and dabbing it inside his lip as he'd seen so many men do, languorous, restless men, hungry-eyed. His heart leapt, knowing that he might no longer be one of them. Beneath the tin of tobacco, the man shook out a long strip of paper. It was crisp and covered in small black etchings. Pirbai's spirits sunk. A test. He had hardly been to school, never learned to read. Now he would have to prove himself smart enough for the job, and he would fail. The man passed him the sheet of paper. He didn't ask Pirbai to read the words, or to recite a poem like the wealthy boys could, or to take up a pen and write. Instead, he produced a small cap of ink and tapped it open, gesturing to the line at the end of the page. If you want to work, you just need to put your thumbprint here, he said. Marveling at his luck, Pirbai let his right thumb sink into the pool of black, all the way until it hit the bottom.
It's gorgeous. It's just so beautiful. So I wanted to ask about the structure of this beautiful novel. It's divided into sections. It's divided into chapters, and each chapter has a different POV. So you actually have 10 different POVs, and it's mostly third and singular, but sometimes third chorus, a wee kind of voice, and sometimes first voice in the last section, and all in past tense except for the epilogue where, you switch into the present tense. So with all of these different things, how did you manage that, especially this being your first novel? Although you were saying that this isn't your actual first novel because you were working on something else, but this is the first novel that you completed, right?
Yeah.
So tell us how you made these choices, a little bit about the writing process and why you wanted to explore the voices of so many different people and which characters you chose to focus on.
Yeah. So when I initially started writing this book, it was not in third person close. It was written in omniscient third. And I think that was because a lot of the books that influenced me, these kind of big multi-generational novels that are spanning time and history, are written often in omniscient. And so that was my kind of starting point. But there was one day where I had a couple of hours and I ended up writing a full chapter, and it just kind of like fell out of me, which is not a regular experience for me. But this chapter came out of me, and it was Rajni, 1947. And it came out in close third. So it was very much in Rajni's body. And very closely, in her consciousness. And I realized something after that chapter came out of me, which is that writing in close third could allow a different kind of intimacy and could allow me to kind of drop down into the character and into the time and place, and just write in a way that felt much more embodied and much more felt. And so I started writing it that way. And then I think for me, the structure also is very much tied to the research process where, we can talk more about it, but the research process for me was very much a process of speaking to family and community who had been through the expulsion or who had lived in Uganda and had been dispersed. Process was very much like a kind of collective remembering, and very much against the Western understanding of archive, this kind of oral history. And so it felt really important to me to reflect that in the book and to have this kind of collective voice as well.
Yeah, I really love that. My debut novel had 7 different POVs, and I always joked that was kind of a stupid thing to do to try for your first novel, just because it is so complex and there are so many things that you have to sort of get right, and trying to get different voices and things like that. Did you, in the writing of this, or maybe in the revision process, did you ever go back and sort of pull all of the voices for one character together to try to get like a unique voice, vis-a-vis a different character who maybe has a lot of the other chapters in that particular section who are contemporaries of theirs and things like that? Did you ever do any of that kind of stuff, or did you write it sort of in the sequence in which they kind of appear in the book?
Yeah, I wrote it over a long period of time, so it's hard to exactly say.
How long did it take?
6 years.
Okay.
Mostly I was writing chronologically, and then sometimes I would just write a random chapter, like I just mentioned, that just came to me or that I felt inspired to write. But I did, during the revision process, kind of do that, like piecing together, and that was mostly when I was thinking about like character arc and development, and thinking about like how has this character shifted and changed from the moment we meet them until the end, the end of their time in the book. And for example, with Rajni, when I did that, I realized a lot about her character, about her kind of like humor and her prickliness, and these parts of her that I think I had in earlier drafts of the book had kind of lost in
when you were writing in the omniscient.
When I was and so coming back to that and sort of putting that back in.
I really loved how the voices were different, but then at the same time, there was a collective mood that I felt like even from chapter to chapter, different chapters, they sort of within a generation or within a setting, I felt like there was something that threaded all of them together, which I just found so beautiful. So even though you did it over 6 years, there was a continuity that sort of held me throughout the entire book. Have you read or have you listened to the audiobook version? I haven't. I read it.
Yeah, I have not yet listened to the audiobook. I was somewhat involved in the
Picking the
in choosing who would read, and so I have some idea of the voices, but yeah, I haven't listened to it yet.
Yeah, I think that would be really, really interesting and fun to do. And the other thing that I wanted to ask you about was the setting. So one of the big themes is one of displacement and trying to find yourself, in the setting. And I mean, I feel like your language, the prose is just so beautiful. And there's just a lot of rich, gorgeous descriptions of that settle us in and then also propel us out, like for the exile and things like that. And I think similar to the characters, there's the structure that you work not only with respect to the characters and their voices, but with respect to the settings too, because we are going from continent to continent. We span 4 continents. And so, so talk a little bit about the setting. Did you go to these places? How did you acquaint yourself? Is there a place where you wrote the most? Any of that kind of stuff?
I wrote most of the book while I was living where I live, which is in Toronto. Okay. And part of the book does take place in Toronto, although in an earlier time. But yeah, I that was a big challenge of writing this book, was writing places that I have not spent a lot of time in physically. And, have
you been to all the places that you write about, or are there some that you've only heard about from your family?
Yeah, I've been to all of the places that are in this book, but not spent a great amount of time. Right. For example, in Uganda, my family only went back once. Yeah. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And so it's not a place that so it was a challenge. And I think for a long time, I also felt, I felt very burdened by that, this sense of like responsibility to do justice to writing these places and these experiences that I myself don't know as intimately. Right. And I think what I really had to realize was that I was writing a Kampala, but not the Kampala. I was writing a Gujarat, but not the Gujarat, because there is no exactly right. That doesn't exist. Yeah, exactly. And so if I could, get the emotional truth of the place right, that was more important than anyone writing anything historical. Exactly. You'll never get every detail right. It's just not possible.
Right. No, definitely. Have you shared this with your family? And I'm just curious what the reaction has been, because with my debut, I did that too. And it was a very emotional thing, getting the reactions of the people who saw themselves and who saw their own lives on the pages. So would love to hear what the reception has been and what that experience has been like.
Yeah. So it felt really important for me to share an early copy of the book with some of my family, with my parents. I just wanted them to be able to read it before, the world of course was able to it. And that was really special. It was really moving to be able to do that, and to hear the ways that they felt. My dad said that it felt like deja vu reading the book. And that, was very poetic and lovely. And other members of my family, I mean, maybe they will read it, maybe they won't. You never know if people will. But I think for me, it's less about whether people read the book and more about, in the process of writing this book, I got to have so many conversations with family members, with community that we weren't having before. Yeah. And that process itself, that's really what mattered.
Of course. Yeah. And because there's so much about sort of the coming together of the voices too. So I can see how your sharing of the and they're sharing with you of the stories, how actually that aids in that sort of communal memory kind of process as well. Yeah, that's really special. Do you have siblings?
I do.
Who were they kind of like, oh, how did you get all of these stories from, like, were they paying attention like in the same way you were?
Yeah.
Are they writers also, or?
No. And I think it is very much like, as a writer, this is my orientation towards the world, and this is how I make sense of things. And so for me, like, writing has always been that way of understanding, making sense of emotion. And so, but they were also involved in, when I started to have these conversations with people, like I would talk to my family about it. I would talk to my sibling.
Yeah. It's so interesting. Talk a little bit about your research process. You talked a little bit about that, and you talked about how a lot of that was in, talking to, your family members and things like that. But a lot of your reviews and the blurbs talk about the specificity and the authenticity. Did you feel like, in addition to talking to them about sort of their experiences and how it felt, that you needed to look up some of the historical, things and geography, like all of that sort of stuff? Like, how did that come together? And it just seems like such an overwhelming amount of stuff, because it spans 100 years and it spans 4 generations and 4 continents.
Yeah, it is and was overwhelming. A lot of research. And I think it's very easy to kind of go down those research rabbit holes of just like, what are all the different plants and trees that are in this place, that would have been in this place.
Right.
And
absolutely,
just kind of like, so many disorganized files of Word documents of just like little notes on my computer. But I think for me, it actually mostly went the other way around. So I started with the book research. I started with the reading and the journal articles and the newspaper clippings and whatever I could find. And very quickly realized that there was very little written about this community, and very little written about this time. And, that's not a coincidence, right? It's an erasure of a marginalized community,
absolutely,
from the dominant narrative. And so it became very clear to me that if I wanted to write this book, I would have to actually have those conversations. And that was really what was going to open up the world for me.
Right. Did you talk to them? I feel like sometimes when I'm doing research for a story, that sometimes I learn just enough to enable me to write. And then I sort of write, and then I go back to kind of see if I got anything right. It's kind of an iterative process. I'm just wondering, just because of that collective memory and because of the erasure and because of the displacement, I'm wondering if that was something that you had to do, actually, say to yourself, give yourself permission to say this is fiction and it's okay.
Right. I think that's the thing, is there was a lot of that back and forth, and there were a lot of moments where I would get really like nervous that I was just getting it wrong, or that I would have to look up this very specific thing or try to find these answers. And in the end, I had to just like very much give myself that permission that this is fiction. It's not about getting every detail right. And it's really about creating that emotional landscape.
Yeah. Because when you were talking about it just now, it made me feel like that's a lot of responsibility to bear, to sort of think to yourself, if the story is about erasure and the story is about displacement and collective memory, then it's a lot to sort of think, okay, what I'm doing here is actually trying to restore some of that. And I can see how that would be a very big burden, especially for fiction, right? Because it's not, so I can see that being like, no wonder it took you. I mean, 6 years to me doesn't seem like that long for a debut, right? For a debut novel, like it takes. But still, like that does seem like a lot of psychological sort of weight.
Yeah, it was definitely a weight, and I think there's a lot of, over the years, a lot of me giving myself permission, a lot of kind of forgiving myself for what I wasn't going to get right. and just kind of telling myself like I'm trying to do justice to this family's story.
Yeah.
Which this family is a fictional family.
Yeah.
It is
it's
not my
your
family.
Right.
It's not any of the people that I was speaking to.
Right.
And it really, in the end, it's about the story.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So it was interesting when you were talking about your process and when you were talking about sort of abandoning kind of, or at least putting on hold the original, debut novel that you were working on, and you started working on this. You said something about, actually getting that voice and then actually like doing all the outlines and things. So are you the kind of writer who outlines? Did you know what was going to happen and how you were going to structure all of these and what the ending of the story would be and all of that sort of stuff?
I think for this book, I really had to outline because it was juggling so much in terms of the history, in terms of the span of time and place. And so I did a lot of outlining, a lot of note taking, and just kind of like, piecing it all together. I did not create a timeline. And then that came back to bite me during
at copy edits.
During the revision process with my editors, where they were doing that, and they, had created their own timelines and realized that several of my characters were like years younger or older than I had.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so that was horrible.
Yes.
And now and I've learned from that. So I think this was a story that required that kind of like planning. But it also, that outlining was also loose. And changed a lot. That original scene that I was talking about in 1971, like that's not in the book anymore.
Oh, wow.
Even though that was the seed for me, but it just is no longer, it no longer fit.
Oh, really?
And so, and there's a lot that, was no longer there. And I'm not sure exactly when in the process I realized what the ending would be. I didn't always know it.
But it's so we won't talk about the ending because and I think you're mouthing to me that like, please don't. No spoilers. No, definitely not. I wanted to read in your Kirkus review, there was one passage that really spoke to me because I was thinking about it and I didn't really realize until I read this that that's what I was admiring so much about your writing. It says, in intimate domestic scenes and scenes of societies in turmoil, she displays a sure-handed ability to write at both small and large scale, and to portray with deep sympathy the universal human desire to find a little place to simply exist freely and with dignity. So it's this combination of the intimacy and sort of the epic saga, like, this huge not just family story, but the historical context of a whole people. And so that feeling of being so huge, but at the same time so intimate, you talked a little bit about it in writing in Close Third, that we are able to get that intimacy, but it's not just intimacy in terms of interiority. It's also intimacy in terms of like little domestic scenes between a wife and a husband, those types of things juxtaposed against what is happening to an entire community of people. Is that something that you feel like you tried to, that you knew you wanted to get to? Because you knew from the outset that you were trying to tell the story of an entire people.
Yeah, I knew from the outset that I was trying to tell this larger story about this time and place and, these real historical events and this community that experienced it. But through all of it, what I'm most interested in is relationships and very much like those intimate moments between family, between lovers, whoever I'm writing about. It's those moments that actually feel gratifying to write and that can actually tell us something, I think, and move the story forward. And really all of that is about like the motivation of this family is always love and safety and kind of protecting one another. And that comes through in those small moments, in the home, in the kitchen. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's so great. Okay. So I want to be mindful of time. But let me ask one final question, and then we'll open it up. I wanted to ask, what are you working on
next?
The big question for all debut novelists, right?
Yeah.
Have you started working on anything new?
I have. This book has been out for 3 weeks, so it's very fresh. So I do think the next thing is like rest and some fallow time, like allowing new material to kind of come in. I have been working on another novel.
Is it the same novel that you abandoned, or no?
No, it is
okay.
Not. That's over.
That's over.
Yeah. That's not coming back.
Okay.
Yeah, that novel was cannibalized into a short story, which was cannibalized into a flash fiction piece, which was published. So that was its final form. And yeah,
great. That's great. I'm glad that you found something for it.
Yeah, it found its place. Yeah, I am working on another novel. It's not something I can talk about yet.
Right now. Okay.
Yeah, I'm still kind of protecting it because I'm figuring out what it is myself.
I totally understand. I'm doing the same thing. When I was on tour for my first book, I talked about my second book, the one that's coming out now, like all the time. And when I went to actually write it, I found that I was not as excited about it because I had talked about it so much.
Yeah.
And so I learned my lesson from that I'm not going to talk about my next book while I'm doing this. But I do think it's a really, really good idea to go ahead and start while you're still promoting your first book, just so you're not like completely insane over, and obsessed over your first book, which is what happened to me. So take it from me, don't do that. Do we have any questions from the virtual audience or from any of you guys? Don't be shy. Yes. We'll take that one and then we'll come to you. Yes. We'll take
So you had mentioned being inspired by historical fiction, and when I read the blurb for your book and listened to this conversation, I was reminded of White Teeth by Janika Smith and Its Children by Salman Rushdie. I was wondering if those were among the ones that inspired you, and if there were others, what the others.
Yeah.
So we should
the question.
Repeat the question. Do you want to repeat the question?
Sure, yeah. So
I can, or whatever.
The question is about the other books that were among the influences of this book. And yes, so White Teeth by Zadie Smith, very much an influence for me, and Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie, hugely influential. And those were some of the first books that I read that I really felt connected to and saw some part of myself in. Other ones are Cutting for Stone by Abraham Verghese, which is a book that I absolutely loved, and also love present tense, and also was the first time that I saw a community adjacent to my community in a book. What else? I
was thinking of Pachinko a little bit, reading this also, just because of that sort of feeling like there's kind of an original sin kind of moment early on with the burning that takes place, and then having the reverberations of that throughout generations, and sort of seeing its impact in the modern, the most modern day generation too.
Pachinko was a book that I came back to a lot writing this. Love Medicine by Louise Erdrich, The Inheritance of Loss by Kiran Desai. These are all books that are kind of, spanning a lot of time and often multiple places, often stories of migration, displacement, and also stories that are very attuned to kind of the messy entanglements of family and community and place and land and, all of that.
Okay, that's great. Do you have a question?
I have the same same exact question, and I was going to ask if Pachinko was one of the books.
Oh, that's great. So so for those of you in the virtual audience, the same exact question. And if Pachinko is one of them, which of course we already discussed. Yeah. Yes, you had another question.
I know that like talking to family and trying to like get personal stories and histories out of people can be so difficult. Did you find that like when doing that research and talking to your family that it was like easy and natural to have those conversations? Did you have to do like digging? Were people forthcoming?
Yeah. So the question, I love this question. Yeah. The question is about talking to the family members during the research process. How difficult was that? Did that come naturally, or what did you have to do a lot of digging? Talk about that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It was very difficult, and because we didn't talk about these things, we didn't tell these stories. I knew very little about all of this from my own family, and so those first couple of years where I was just reading books and articles and trying to research that way, that was because I was nervous to talk to my family. I was avoiding it. And it just became clear that I couldn't write the book if I didn't. And so I had to. I was very nervous too, because also I was very aware that it is a sensitive history. It's hard to talk about. And that I am a generation removed. And so my relationship to it is different. But at the same time, I found that there was also a great amount of kind of openness when we did start talking about it. I think there's kind of particularly, a lot of the people I was speaking to were like in their 80s, in their 70s and 80s. And so I think there's like this real feeling of like, oh, if we don't talk about it, nobody will know. Like we have so many stories, right? And so actually it did really open up. And
also kind of, if your family is anything like mine, a kind of almost like a relief, like, wow, you really are interested in us. You really are interested in our history. And then once that openness sort of comes in, then almost, a relief of like, I can tell you all of these things, and then the closeness that builds. And I think that's why I was asking you before, like how your siblings felt about this, because I know my cousins, a lot of them, I'm an only child, but even so, because we're the same generation, they were kind of like, how did you even find out all of this stuff that, that kind of amazement almost that you would have found out something when they didn't know it.
Yeah. And I think there is something really, really special about being asked to tell your story the way you remember it. And I think especially when, the articles and the way that this history is represented, it's very skewed. It's really not the way that the family and the community remember it or experienced it. And so being able to kind of, be actively part of rewriting that is really special and felt really important to me. Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? Yes. Okay, great.
So I'll read it and then you can repeat it. In the novel, displacement often separates elder siblings from younger siblings. What elements did you consider for differentiating between displaced siblings versus displaced parent-child relationships, especially when age difference and gender expectations were these categories?
I'm not sure that we need to repeat since they can see. Is that okay? Oh, okay, great. Okay. Or you can.
Yeah. So the question I think is about the different dynamics between the generations versus kind of horizontal.
Yeah. Intra versus intergenerational relationships, and how the displacement disparately affected the differences.
Yeah. So something I was really interested in when I was writing this book was the ways that that memories, stories, experiences, feelings pass down and trickle down through the generations in an active way. And then also what happens when they're not actively shared, when we're not actively telling these stories, and yet somehow they're still manifesting. And so I think I was thinking a lot about that between parents and children, or grandparents and grandchildren, and the ways that certain questions that the older generations are dealing with are still coming up for later generations. Questions about taking care of each other, about taking care of community, about surviving. How do we, survive and also support each other? Yeah, I was really interested in seeing the ways that those were kind of mirrored over the generations, but also seeing how they would change.
Right. And how, but among like siblings, how it can affect them differently, sometimes in opposite ways too.
Right. And a lot of this novel is kind of centering on these three sisters and the ways that they are growing up in the same generation, time and place, and yet their experience of the expulsion and of
different.
are completely different.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Any other questions, you think? Yeah.
I'm always interested in stories that, as you say, are not really explored very much in literature. And one thing that was coming to me as I was reading it is you have this layer of colonialization with the Ugandan people, but then you also have the displacement of the Indian people who were in Uganda. So I was just wondering how you sort of navigated like both of those layers of oppression, really.
So the question is about the kind of navigating the two layers of colonialism with the Ugandan people, and also with the displaced Indian South Asian migrants. And that is something that that I was thinking about to a great degree when I was writing this book, because that has always been a question for me, is, what does it mean to be a migrant community in another colonized place? And, thinking about my own family, that we are both refugees and settlers on stolen land. And so what does that mean? And how do we kind of, understand that? And so these were questions that I was really thinking about. And I think from that very first burning, which is not really a spoiler because it's in the opening chapter, but that in itself is really
also in the jacket too.
And,
right?
And the jacket copy is really thinking about, survival and the lengths that we go to survive, to secure our place, and how, what does it mean, or what happens when that comes at another community's expense? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it's so fascinating because I've actually been listening to this podcast that I was listening to about a month ago, was talking about some scientific studies that are being done right now with different generations of I think it's actually like worms or something like that, and how there's like intergenerational trauma that gets passed down that you can actually see in the DNA that gets passed down. That there is, it's so you think of DNA and genetic stuff as like stuff that you're born with that's immutable, but of course that's not true. Your genes do change as you experience things, and how those changes can actually occur in the sex genes that get passed down that produce your offspring. And so there is actually a scientific basis, a genetic basis for explaining intergenerational trauma that gets passed down. It's fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
And I was just like, wow, I could really go down, and like, because there's so much of this kind of memory, that the intergenerational memory that does get passed down, that I think it's so fascinating.
Yeah. And I think I wanted to add one more thing. When thinking about that question, there's the side of it that's really about complicity, and like how is this community, this South Asian migrant community, complicit in the colonization or the project of colonization in this place. But also there's the other side of it, which is about resistance, which is also a really large part of this book, and about solidarities, and the ways that cross-community, cross-racial solidarity is not a new conversation. It has been happening for decades and decades. And when I was researching this book, there were examples of that happening in Uganda in the 60s, in London in the 70s, like all of these examples of people across communities coming together. And, it doesn't erase the like messiness of coming together with different communities and the power dynamics between them, but that has always been happening and is still happening. Yeah.
Any other questions? I think we have room for one final question.
More virtual questions.
Oh, okay. Excellent.
And it's related to Destiny's question. So how did your research influence how you approached including Black African perspectives in the novel?
Yeah. So the question is, how did the research influence including Black African perspectives in the novel? So there really, when I was researching this novel, I was speaking to and reading about South Asian migrants, and that was the community that this novel is focused on. And this novel is written from 10 perspectives, and all of those perspectives are from one Indian family.
Right.
I did not want to write from the perspective of a Black African or Ugandan person, because I didn't feel that was my place, or that was what I was coming to this book with. But at the same time, it's very much part of the research, very much part of the landscape that I was, it's impossible to write this book and not be thinking about that. And there are some really important characters in this book who are, for example, Adroa, who's I don't think it's a spoiler.
When in doubt, let's not spoil. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I won't say any more about that, but there are some very important characters in this book. And I think I was always thinking about and paying attention to the relationships between Black Africans and the Indo-Ugandans. And that was kind of the place that I would come to it from. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And there's because I was thinking also of Pachinko as well, because of the whole Korean Japanese. But, in that, it's a little bit, it's in one sense more complicated and in one sense less complicated because of the race ethnicity question, being sort of more uniform, and versus what you have here. It's so interesting to think about, because that's just not what we normally think about, and that's what makes it so fascinating and such an educational thing, which is what I love to get from my historical fiction, as well as the beautiful writing and just getting lost in the family dynamics too. So anyway, I think we are out of time. This has been fascinating. Thank you so much for writing a beautiful book and for this wonderful discussion. And thank you so much to East City and to everybody here. And please, let's everybody support East City by buying this wonderful book and getting it signed. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you everyone for being here. Hey. Upstairs, yeah, my register for you. Here you go. Oh, thank you. That was such a great combo. Yeah. I think I've only ever read a middle grade book. I forget what it's called. Sunset. Sunset is in the title.
The one I'm thinking of is called
I'm not familiar with that one.
I think it's maybe young adult.
Yeah, but this one is
Middle grade.
Yeah, it's in the Sunset.
Oh,
So
interesting.
yeah, before I'd never read a book that's about this.